The town of Dustridge lay abandoned, its wooden buildings bleached by the desert sun, its streets choked with sand. It was a place of ghosts, where the echoes of the gold rush lingered in the empty saloons and boarded up mines. The few who dared venture into Dustridge spoke of a strange drumming, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. It began subtly, a faint pulse beneath the silence, like the distant beat of a forgotten machine. As the days grew hotter and the nights colder, the drumming intensified, becoming a relentless, rhythmic pounding. Those who camped near the abandoned mines swore they heard it, a persistent thumping that seemed to emanate from the very ground itself. Jess, a geologist searching for rare minerals, was drawn to Dustridge's isolation. She dismissed the local tales as superstition, but the drumming piqued her scientific curiosity. She spent her days examining the abandoned mine shafts, and the drumming had grown progressively worse. It wasn't the usual sounds of an old mine settling. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost intentional. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get out. At night, as the drumming vibrated through the empty town, she'd lie awake, listening. The noise would resonate from the ground beneath her, growing louder until it became unbearable. One night, her curiosity reached its peak. Armed with a powerful headlamp and a sense of scientific rigor, Jess followed the sound to the entrance of the main mine shaft. The beam of her light revealed a loose timber in the support structure. Her breath caught in her throat. The drumming had been coming from here. She stood frozen, as if the mine itself might suddenly awaken. But she had to know. She carefully pried the timber loose. It crumbled in her hands, and as the last fragment fell to the dusty floor, she gasped. There, in the gap behind the timber, was an eye. It was wide and dark, its gaze intense and hollow. Jess's heart pounded in her chest, the headlamp trembling in her hand. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The eye seemed to be staring directly at her, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. And then the drumming stopped. For a long, long moment, there was only the silence of the desert and the stillness of the mine. The eye blinked slowly, a sign of life in the darkness beyond the wood. Jess's fingers were frozen to the edges of the gap, her pulse racing in her throat. Something was wrong, very wrong. Before she could react, the earth began to shift, a movement so subtle that it could have been mistaken for the settling sand. The space behind the timber was larger than it had seemed, an empty, hollow cavern stretching beyond. A figure, a man, shifted within it. He was hunched, his body pressed against the rough rock, as if he had been waiting there, trapped, for years. His face, pale and gaunt, was etched with a kind of desperation, the same wild look that now filled Jess's mind. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly moved forward. The eye blinked again, and then, before she could scream, a hand, long and bony, shot out from the hole in the wood, grasping at her wrist with an unnatural strength. The mine groaned around her, the earth seeming to close in. She yanked her arm back, but the grip was unyielding. The man's hand pulled her toward the gap in the wood, the dark space beyond it seeming to swallow everything in its path. And as the last fragment of the timber crumbled away, the man's face came into full view, his eyes wide with a hunger that could not be sated. With a final scream, Jess was dragged into the gap, her body vanishing into the darkness behind the wood. The drumming resumed, this time louder than ever. The next morning, the town of Dustridge stood silent, the sun beating down on its empty streets. Jess's equipment remained undisturbed, and there was no sign of her anywhere. The locals spoke of her in hushed tones, but no one knew where she had gone. No one but the man beyond the wood. And the drumming? It was still there, echoing through the earth, louder than ever, as if waiting for the next curious soul to come too close. On the outskirts of town stood a house that no one dared to approach. Its walls, once white and welcoming, had faded into a greyish hue, as though time itself had slowly drained all life from its bones. The windows were cracked, some boarded up, and ivy crept along the brick, as if it was trying to reclaim the structure for nature. Locals spoke in hushed tones when its name came up. No one dared speak of it for too long, for fear that the house might hear. The stories had circulated for decades, of those who had ventured inside, curious or desperate, seeking to uncover the mystery of the house. Only a few returned. Those few spoke with vacant eyes. Their words trembled, and their minds seemed forever altered. Many believed the house had a life of its own, one that fed off the fears of those who dared to enter. It wasn't long before the whispers began. Those who dared cross the threshold of the old house found themselves haunted by strange, ethereal voices. The voices came not in words, but in whispers, too soft to fully comprehend, yet too chilling to ignore. They seemed to float in the air, curling around corners, slipping through cracks, until they reached the ears of those within. The whispers weren't just fleeting sounds. They had substance, a presence, an almost physical force that pushed in closer and closer. It was as if the house was breathing, drawing in the secrets of the world and exhaling them in haunting murmurs. The most terrifying part wasn't the voices themselves, but the way they spoke. At first, they whispered about trivial things only the person within could know. A forgotten childhood memory, a long-lost dream, a shameful regret. But then, as the days wore on, the whispers grew darker. They began to speak of things far more sinister, things no one had ever dared to admit aloud, dark secrets, long-hidden fears, betrayals that had been buried under the weight of time. But that wasn't all. The voices began to predict the future. They would murmur things that hadn't happened yet. They would whisper the name of a loved one about to fall ill, or a friend who would soon betray them. They would speak of death, cold and distant, but with terrifying accuracy. But it wasn't the predictions that terrified people. It was the death they foretold. As the years passed, the stories grew more twisted. One man entered the house to seek answers, and when he returned, his eyes were empty, his movements stiff, as though he had seen things no one should ever see. A week later, he was found, lifeless in his home, with a look of horror frozen on his face. No marks, no sign of struggle, just a look that seemed to suggest he had seen the very thing the house had whispered. There was another woman, too, who had entered the house on a dare. She left with an unsettling calmness, as though something inside her had broken. Her family tried to comfort her, but every night she would sit by her window, staring into the distance, as if waiting for something. A month later, she disappeared without a trace. No one saw her leave. No one heard a sound. But the house seemed to be waiting for her return. Over time, people stopped talking about the house altogether. It became a place of legend, something whispered about only when the wind howled and the dark clouds gathered. It stood there, a silent observer of time, its secrets hidden behind its crumbling walls. But there were still those who couldn't resist. A few brave, or perhaps foolish souls would venture into its dark embrace, eager to discover the truth behind the whispers. None of them ever returned the same. None of them were ever quite whole again. And yet, the house still stood. Its whispers never ceased. It was as though the house itself had learned to listen, to breathe, to wait. It waited for the next person to enter, the next secret to unravel, the next death to be foretold. And sometimes, just sometimes, The whispers would stop for a moment, as though it was listening intently. Then, after a brief silence, a new voice would join in. A voice, not from within the house, but from the darkness itself. It was a voice that could only belong to one who had never left. A voice that whispered, "You're next." And the house, still standing, waited. If you felt the fear, like and subscribe. More disturbing tales are coming soon.